My name is Liz Johnston, and I'm here with my colleague, Emily Coombs Waddell, and we are both labor and employment attorneys at Verrill.
Hi, everybody.
So some of you may have seen our recent presentation for ACC called Don't Get Caught, Traps for the Unwary in Employer DE&I Initiatives. And we wanted to dig a little bit deeper into one of the topics that we brought up during that presentation, specifically affinity groups, and discuss a little bit more of what to consider from a legal perspective if your organization utilizes those in the workplace.
So before we dive into the legal risks associated with affinity groups, let's first talk about what they are. So affinity groups, which are sometimes called employee resource groups or ERGs, are groups designed to help bring people together of similar interests, backgrounds, experiences. And historically, these groups in workplaces have been built around legally protected characteristics such as race, gender, or sexual orientation, but they also can be premised on interests or experiences that are unrelated to legally protected traits.
Yeah, many employers are using affinity groups, or ERGs as Emily called them, as part of their plan to promote diversity and equity and inclusion in the workplace. And there's a good reason for this. They can really help with employee networking, employees building relationships with each other, building mentoring relationships. All of this can really increase morale, retention, productivity, all really good things. But when we're talking about affinity groups, despite all of the benefits that can be associated with them, there are still legal risks to consider in the employment context.
That's right. And one of the key areas to really watch out for in this area is making sure that employees who are or are not part of affinity groups are treated equally. So in our practice, one of the main reasons we see employers facing a discrimination charge is because an employee or a group of employees feel that they're being treated differently than others. Now, I know that everyone watching this understands that employees have to be treated equally without regard to protected traits. But in the context of affinity groups or ERGs, it does get a little bit tricky just because issues might arise if some affinity groups or members of affinity groups opposed to not members of affinity groups are given special privileges or benefits that are different compared to others. It could play out in a couple different ways. Perhaps it's in a funding situation. Maybe some groups are entitled to office space on company property. And there are also situations that might come up, depending on break time to attend meetings and other areas that could, from an employee perspective, feel like entitlements given to some people, but not others.
That's a really great point, Emily. There was actually a case in Maine a few years back where an employee claimed that she was being discriminated against on the basis of her sexuality. And one of the bases for her claim was she had discussed how her manager told her that she couldn't take breaks to attend affinity group meetings for an LGBT group, whereas other employees at the organization were allowed to continue taking breaks to attend meetings for different affinity groups. So the First Circuit Court of Appeals actually determined that that was a relevant factor in deciding whether a hostile work environment existed in the workplace for that employee. So speaking of break times, that actually brings up another issue that's important to consider when we're talking about affinity groups, and that is whether the time spent by employees in group meetings or activities is going to be considered compensable work time. And that could be considered compensable if the activities are related in any way to the employee's work, or if they're doing any productive work for the organization during that time and with those projects. So if you're an organization who has exempt employees participating in these meetings or these groups, and those employees aren't being paid for those activities, it's really important to consider whether that work time or whether that time needs to be considered work time and under the FLSA.
I agree. So one thing I would also recommend to companies with affinity groups is to create a policy that clearly addresses these issues. So for example, specifying whether meetings can be held during or outside of work hours, how employees should be keeping track of the time they're spending in these types of activities, as well as just the basics about how affinity groups can form at your organization. So what criteria should be met for the group to be approved, and whether any particular categories of affinity groups will not be recognized. So for example, those that promote religious or political positions, or groups that do not tie back to an employment related purpose.
A really great point, Emily. And as employment lawyers, I'm sure you'll hear us say it all the time, and I'm sure others, but we love to have a policy in place to address these issues before they become an issue. And if I had a policy, I would also want to make sure that the policy for affinity groups specified that membership in the groups can't be based on a protected trait, whether you have it or you don't, as well as making sure to reference that, other company policies are still in place, and particularly anti-harassment and anti-discrimination policies. Also making sure that your complaint procedure is up to date to make reports of any violations of those policies is really important.
Definitely. And of course, making sure that managers are up to date and trained as well.
Definitely. Well, with that, I think we're out of time for today, and there's always more to talk about, but we really appreciate you tuning in and hope you learned a little bit more about what to keep an eye out for when it comes to employee resource groups.